Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. I recorded a podcast with Daniel Hardman a bit earlier this year in May. For those interested in that one, it's episode 53 of the SSI Orbit podcast. And in that podcast, and the reason why I'm mentioning it, it's kind of related to the conversation today, we discussed the implications of moving forward with client-server architectures for digital identity implementations. And really not to sway people away from it, but just to understand the trade-offs that we make when we make these architectural decisions. So it's a bit more of a higher level conversation. And I think in this conversation today, we're going to be talking along the same lines of these things, but perhaps going a little bit deeper and talking about more examples, talking about some of the technologies, some of the implementations. And I guess the framing I wanted to use for this conversation, which I think is in tangents to the client server one in some ways, is that for common computing tasks today, we either do them through sessions or non-sessions. So we have session-based activities and non-session-based activities. A couple examples of when we would use sessions, if we're logging into a website, for example, like logging into my online banking or social media, the server establishes a session with my device, and the session allows the server to remember me as I navigate from page to page, keeping me logged in and such. Second example could be video conferencing, like we're on Zoom right now. Tools like Zoom or Teams establish a session between all the participants. So these are kind of some session-based activities, and then some non-session-based activities. A couple examples, one could be email. So while you may log into your email, which could be a session-based activity, the act of sending and receiving emails is non-session-based. So your email client sends a request to the server to send or check for new email and then disconnects. And downloading files could be a second example of non-session-based activities. So when you download a file, your device sends a request, the server responds by sending the file, but doesn't establish a lasting session. And I'm wondering if this is a good place to bring in verifiable credentials. Over the past year or so, I would say, we're starting to see more mainstream adoption of verifiable credentials across session-based and non-session-based activities, with maybe a little more focus recently on session-based activities, being able to use verifiable credentials for similar workflows that we're used to today, like logging into a website or logging into a video conferencing application. But you also can imagine maybe some restrictions in this model versus kind of a non-session based activity, where in a session-based activity, I'm typically just going to be a holder presenting credentials and I'm interacting with a verifier, for example, which could be the service provider. Whereas in a non-session based one, I can imagine maybe being able to play different roles as a consumer. So I could be a holder, but maybe I want to be a verifier in a specific use case, which could, in my email or downloading file example, maybe I want to verify the integrity of an email or a file. So with all this, is this a good framing, kind of looking at different ways of exchanging credentials and different interaction models, looking at it through session-based and non-session-based activities?
Maybe. The interesting part about the session-based stuff you're describing is that the session is typically maintained by the server in a client-server model, right? So you authenticate to it, and then they pass you some sort of a token, a cookie, or whatever else that you pass back to help them know that the next action is associated with the same session. But that session is maintained only on one side, and it's also typically not created by either party. In a client-server scenario, the server is always the one that creates and maintains the session, and the client is responsible for passing some sort of thing to reassociate a future action with the same session. And I think that the types of interactions that we have, certainly the ones that I envision that are a little more peer-to-peer, it's not that you don't have the concept of a session exactly, but the roles are different in the sense that both parties are participating in the session or the maintenance of the session, and either one of them can establish it, and that architecturally is different than the traditional client-server model.
I would also add, I think a lot of what you described, Mathieu, it's definitely session-based, but it's also web-centric. So when we look at your examples, use I log in through the web to do a video conference. video conference, WebRTC is relatively new. That was a whole different channel by itself. Voice was a whole different channel by itself. One of the problems with session-based, especially when you're web-based sessions, you can't jump between channels. I can't use the same identifier to go direct on a SIP video call, chat with you in a chat client if you're my customer service agent, and then do a voice call. I have to reestablish myself every time. And that's a very identity-centric and web-centric approach. And I don't know that it kind of works, but it's a really weird way to do things given what we have today.
What would be some other ways of looking at it? You said that then in a session-based or client-server architecture, it's very ID-centric or web-centric. What would be some other ways of looking at it? Because it seems like these just tend to be common ways of just automatically looking at it this way because it's the way that things are done today. What would be some alternatives?
One of the most novel things I saw, I haven't actually seen it in a bit, was Vic at a company called Hero was working on, specifically, he came out of the call center world, where their world is managing chats coming in, tickets coming in through the web, both of those, phone calls coming in, video screen sharing, all of these different technologies. And their business problem that they were solving was, how do you identify the customer uniquely, as opposed to it being, Telegram Sam on chat, Sam Curren on an email address, and some phone number that's coming in, and I have no idea. It's all Sam. They basically had it so that it was all peer-to-peer. It was, hey, let's establish our connection and then figure out which medium we're going to talk through. Am I submitting a ticket on a website? Am I phoning you through voice over IP? Am I sending a text message into my own app? It's all the same identifier then. So it really simplified a lot of things.
So the other Hero thing that they did was that they used a foundational secure communication channel to then sort of pre-coordinate the cryptography of other things. So if you wanted to open up an WebRTC call, they would coordinate that over a DIDComm channel, so that you had a transitive trust relationship between the existing secure DIDComm channel that you had and the resulting WebRTC call. And that's important. It's worth recognizing that we don't actually have sort of a de facto secure baseline communication channel on the internet these days. We have lots of channels, but nothing that operates like a baseline. And that's really interesting, because it isn't so much that baseline has to do everything, but if you can start there and build on it, then you can do all sorts of interesting things. And I think that's one of the things that we're lacking. I think one of the reasons why the predominant architecture of the internet today is client server is that we lack any sort of ability to do that. It's even hard to create a person-to-person chat system that is not fundamentally client server. You can do it. There's parties that have done it, but typically, most of them involve, at least in the pre-coordination steps, some sort of not really that decentralized type of a way to do it, just because it's hard. And imagine the type of world that we would have if we had a baseline secure communication channel that we could use to communicate and coordinate all sorts of things, whether it happened inside of that channel or whether it bootstrapped things that happened in other channels. I think there's some real power there. And that's the opportunity for something like DIDComm that Vic was using at Hero. I say Vic, I'm blaming him for all of his team's good work, but that Hero is using in order to base that off of. That's an interesting case, because the predominant use case, they involved credentials, but the predominant use case they had was not verifiable credential centric. They recognized the value of that common communication channel, independent of credentials that might be passed over it.
For folks maybe a bit less familiar with something like DIDComm, and we talk a bit on this podcast at times, we've mentioned the concept of a trust spanning protocol as well, which I think is just this communication channel you're referring to, and DIDComm has a lot of the properties that perhaps would be a good solution for this. Could you maybe go a little bit deeper into what this communication channel like DIDComm is? What are some of its properties, and kind of how it would fit within our everyday lives and on the web and such?
Sure, and it might be instructive to compare it to some of the existing more familiar technologies as well. DIDComm is a message-based protocol for communicating between any two parties that have a DID. Those parties can be organizations or individuals or things. And the messages are sent encrypted. It is transport agnostic in the sense that the security properties and the useful properties of a DIDComm message don't come from the transport, that it's sent across. And as a result, you can have very similar interactions, for example, over HTTP or WebSockets or even a Bluetooth connection without the fundamental nature of the messaging changing. One way of comparing DIDComm is by comparing it to an API. We're pretty familiar with HTTP-based APIs where you make a request and get a response back, and you have an interface. The server that hosts the API has an interface that you interact with it. On the DIDComm side, you have protocols, and that defines the types of interactions, the types of messages that you can send and receive, similar to the way that you can make an HTTP request, for example, and get a predictable response back. There's some differences that are important here. DIDComm is not fundamentally client server. It is fundamentally peer-to-peer, which means that even if I am interacting with my bank, they of course are the bank and I am me, but from a protocol design perspective, the DIDComm doesn't care necessarily who's in charge. The protocols designed on top of it have specific roles that you can play to help facilitate that interaction. But the initiation of an interaction can actually happen by either party. So it might be me reaching out to the bank to start something. It might be the bank reaching out to me to start something. Hey, we've got a low account balance, warning that we wanted to notify you of. And then, I could follow up by transferring some money or from a different account or something like that. But the bank could reach out to me to do that, which is not typically done in API architectures. Typically what would happen is they would prompt something out of band. They would send me an email or a text message, both, notoriously secure. I'm winking a little bit methods of communicating, and then they would basically prompt me to start something rather than like them starting something with me, and that's interesting because when you host an API, you're generally relying upon people calling it in order to interact with them. We have things like webhooks, but it's not a great architectural solution, particularly when you're trying to do things in a trusted way where the trust is bidirectional. The mutual authentication piece is really important here. The other interesting bit is that I might be interacting with you or with Darrell, and rather than one of us being a bank, we're just both people, but we can still engage in protocols back and forth between each other, and that's a really powerful thing. And so thinking of the way we interact with the internet, far less in the ability to host a large API, but rather just the ability to support protocols and protocols that are friendly to the devices that we use. We can have a smartphone that speaks these protocols, even though it's not highly available and occasionally gets out of a signal range or runs out of battery or something like that. And so the ability to have something that is friendly to human, to the types of devices that humans tend to use is a pretty important dynamic when it comes to the creation of really powerful trust infrastructures on the internet.
And I think I would add one of the examples I would give Mathieu that is like chat clients. So we take a look at like Signal or WhatsApp. Signal or WhatsApp are kinda peer-to-peer. I mean, I can chat with you on either of those. I know that, I send you a message. I know that, I get the two open check marks. Well, something's got it, but you haven't read it and haven't seen it. Okay, I get the two colored in check marks and you've seen it. There's a couple of problems there. One is that WhatsApp or Signal are in the middle there. They're aware that this channel is being used. I may not see the contents you see and encrypted, but there's also a business problem that happens that it's tied to your phone number. If you ever go and travel and pop a SIM card in temporarily, your Signal, WhatsApp, and other messaging systems just became hell. And then you return home and it's a new hell. And because it's tied to, and it was initiated through your cell phone. And there are ways for people to take over. But more important, what Sam was saying, this ability to be offline completely and do stuff. I need to arrange to make a payment to you. Great, perfect. I can start with that. You come back online and we continue. That's really important, both on a chat client, but also just when I'm building systems. It makes it a lot easier than me having this workable but strange webhook pattern that Sam has mentioned a few times.
So I think it's helpful to understand that a lot of the ways that identifiers are looked at today are from a very ID-centric, web-centric view, I think it's quite helpful to understand, Sam, kind of what is involved with who starts interaction, what's possible, what's not possible, and you end up having to use out-of-band channels, which could cause security issues or user experience issues and such. We're seeing a lot of momentum right now behind some client-server architecture-based protocols for exchanging verifiable credentials, talking specifically about OpenID for verifiable credential. And I don't think throughout this conversation we're saying anything negative or positive, whatever. We're just trying to talk about the trade-offs that you get by using these different things. But is something like DIDComm like too disruptive for certain groups of people? Is the scope maybe a bit too large? And then maybe kind of related to that, are some of these other client server protocols like OpenID, could these things kind of work on top of a protocol like DIDComm that would kind of give us that baseline peer-to-peer communication channels that we could use?
So there's a couple of interesting topics in there. DIDComm is often seen as a sort of a large solution, and I think that it's seen most frequently by those that are mostly focused on verifiable credentials as an end. Their whole goal is to enable the use of verifiable credentials, which is good. I'm a fan of verifiable credentials. They do a lot for, portable trust and all sorts of things. But I'm always constantly asking myself, what next? What do we then use the trust that we have established to actually do? And I think of verifiable credentials as more of a means to an end rather than an end. None of us gets giddy excited when we have to show our driver's license when we're renting a car or something. It's not an exciting thing. The fact that we get to rent a car is kind of what we're after, right? And so it's similar. I think it's worth understanding and appreciating TLS, but when I sit down and open up a browser to do something, I'm not excited about the ability to use TLS, right? That's it's kind of a clean sheets type of thing where it's got to work well and it has to have the properties that I need. But then I want to go about building other things. And the reason why DIDComm is larger than just verifiable credentials is for this reason, is that when you have verifiable credentials and you exchange this portably trusted data, it enables lots of behaviors and those behaviors, in my experience, tend to need communication. You've got to communicate securely with the other party. And so if you're going to that point where you're going to have this type of additional communication, additional interaction with the other party, then starting with something that kind of has batteries included ways to do that is a good way to do it. There's a handful of really desired properties to the OpenID for verifiable credentials approach, and certainly one of them is brand name recognition. You have a lot of people that maybe don't know what to do, but they know OpenID, and so they think, oh, this is great. So they're leveraging the brand to help people be more comfortable with the adoption of verifiable credentials, and I think that's awesome. It's also worth noting that if you happen to pass a DID as part of your interaction through one of the OpenID for VC protocols, and that DID happens to have a DIDComm endpoint on it, you could actually bootstrap into something more later. So there are ways that the technologies can work together in a useful way. And of course, if you already have an interaction with someone, via DIDComm, and you happen to engage because of the requirements or the circumstances or the support in something in one of the OpenID for VC related protocols, then you can of course tie the context together that happened in the OpenID for VC protocols with the interactions that you've previously had with that party via DIDComm. So there's definitely some interactions that can happen there. There's a number of, so in addition to the extra things that you can do, like the non-VC related things, there's some interesting VC related options that you have with DIDComm as well. And again, this is initiated by the other party. The OpenID flows involve the user doing something like scanning a QR code or in order to sort of begin this exchange, whether it's to receive an issued credential or to present one. There's a handful of useful things that we can imagine. For example, like when a credential is revoked by the issuer, it would be really handy to inform the holder of that credential that credential has been revoked. They can probably discover it on their own, but proactively reaching out and say, by the way, this has been revoked is really useful. And that's an initiation that takes place from the issuer side, not from the credential holder side, which means that the OpenID for VC protocols don't serve that case particularly well. And I'm sure that you could design something that could work in concert with it, like a status URL that they could call or something that they could work out. But it's not, there's not like an easy way to just sort of reach out and notify the other party that something's happened. DIDComm actually has a credential or a revocation notification protocol that can be called, and if you've got a DIDComm connection, then you can send those messages when it occurs, which enables a much cleaner user experience, as the user can sort of become aware that their credential has been revoked before they attempt to present it, and theoretically, chase a resolution to that.
Sam, I would also add that revocation capability allows us to do an update where we revoke and replace. Classic example, I mean, Apple Wallet only recently started doing this, where you can actually, it reaches in and replaces a plane ticket with an updated version that's all protocol based on the app itself, talking to the wallet. DIDComm would just be able to just say, no, just replace this thing.
So imagine I get issued like an employee credential to build on your example, Darrell, and they made a mistake, and like I don't know, they fat fingered something on the data entry or something, and like they put me as my start date is like 10 years ago, and this is one of the reasons you need revocation. Is occasionally you might issue a credential in error. There's other reasons, but this is a useful one. The ability for them to revoke the previous credential and reissue one, but coordinate that in a way that presents a really nice user experience for me is great. Finding out that the previous credential that I had is revoked, and then I suddenly, without warning, have to go get a new one so that I can, like, I don't know, enter the workplace or log on to the internal website for the company is a little bit jarring. And so having a protocol that can reach out and say, hey, we've revoked your credential, but we have one that we're issuing as a replacement. Here you are, and you can engage in that process. And the ability of the software on the holder side to see those notifications and then present a fluid, a useful, helpful UX to the user is pretty important there. And so that's an example of a issuer initiated communication that can do a lot for the types of user experiences that we need. I think we have to pay attention to these things. The OpenID flows are doing so by capitalizing on sort of the brand recognition of OpenID and some familiar flows that people are used with, and that's good. We're helping people adopt new technology, but the value of being able to have a communication channel and not just engage with a single interaction over a credential, I think has some really incredible potential for a smoother user experience in ways that we need to pay attention to.
We talked a bit about some of the stuff that we could do without verifiable credentials over DIDComm. Why, if I'm in the shoes of a digital identity program and I'm looking to launch some initiatives to issue credentials or have wallets and such, why should I care about these other things outside of verifiable credentials right now?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is the fun part of the industry. This new verifiable credentials capability came about. The question I think you're asking is, if I'm already speaking OIDC, as my lingua franca, that's just how I do stuff, and I can issue verifiable credentials, great, I'll do that. Which also means that OIDC becomes even more powerful, more common in the identity, the IAM, the identity and access management space. So you end up using and leveraging the benefits of it, meaning I don't have to log in for OAuth. I can give you a credential that's stored in my system, and you can go use it elsewhere without bogging down my OAuth flows. That's powerful. But what if I'm not identity centric? This is where things get weird for the people who are looking at verifiable credentials. So they're looking, going, I have a bunch of data in a database about a thing. I want to issue a product passport, and it's not in my IAM. It's in my ERP, my enterprise resource planning system, or some manufacturing management system. I want to issue a credential and say, well, you need to speak OIDC. It's like, that just doesn't make any sense at all. They speak SQL, they speak JSON, and they speak XML. They're like, no, I just want to take data and issue this thing. So it's kind of part of the world that's doing the OIDC approach, the OpenID for VC, for example, to tell someone who has a database, it doesn't make any sense. Flip that around, though. If I'm identity centric, of course I'm going to use OIDC because I speak it natively. It's just my way of talking.
I think even in the IAM space, there's some opportunities. For example, right now when we authenticate to, say, a website, and the dream is to kill passwords, whatever method we have to do to get there, right? But when we authenticate to a website, we often do stuff, and they tend to time out a session if it's not active for a little while, and that's because they're afraid that someone else is going to walk up and use their computer or something else. there's a number of cases that would benefit greatly from additional authorization or confirmation of certain actions. Let me just give a personal bank example. If and maybe the bank just does this by policy, or maybe I've asked this to happen, but let's say there's a money transfer of more than $5,000 that happens in my banking, and someone requests this. How powerful would it be to be able to get a secure confirmation of that action? Even I'm still sitting in front of the computer, but I get a ping on my phone.
So we did that,
like a DIDComm protocol saying, like, hey, there's a $5,000 thing. Do you want to approve this? And I can respond on my phone, which makes it much more difficult for people to take advantage of, and for hacking and other sorts of things. Or even that someone that like slips in and grabs my computer real quick and, hey, I'm going to transfer $5,000 to whatever. And that's really powerful. That's not something that is traditionally considered IAM, at least not mainstream IAM today, but should be, because of the power that provides.
So we did that with the Member Pass program. They actually have exactly that capability. One of the weirdest, perhaps this is not done by Canadian institutions, but down in the States, there's a lot of the banking core is actually many systems that are not really integrated. If you want to get identity nerdy, there are like SAML linkages between these things. They wanted to actually issue the following question that says, hey, Sam, did you just apply for and get funding, get approved for a $50,000 car loan? Because their car loan system would actually transfer into the account. If they're sitting at your account, they immediately wire it out and it's gone. This ability to just send it did two things. One, it made the member feel much more sure of things. Like you said, Sam, did you just send $5,000? But also the security folks were very excited about the fact that it was out of band. It was not coming through the same web channel. So to your point, I have to compromise your device, and I have to compromise the device you're doing the work at, and compromise the phone internals. Now I've got a really hard bar, and they were actually getting quite a few fraud things. They do the same thing. Are you at the branch at Long and Main? Because they have in-person fraud that they're resisting, all with a simple API call that goes over DIDComm that says, are you blah, blah, yes or no?
So we touched on a couple things, benefits with traditional IAM, and we've talked about also the non-IAM, relevant uses, which I think is also pretty important. The other thing to consider here is things that are not traditionally IAM that bleed into what Darrell and I were just talking about, and one of them is like confirmations. A lot of people don't consider like a text message notification to be part of IAM, but the insecurity of text messaging and email, et cetera, are part of the problem that affects IAM. And so even if you're happy with things like verifiable credentials, but you also have like customer contact things like text messaging because it's a better user experience than the other options that we have, you want to consider this because it bleeds into those spaces as well. Even though it isn't core IAM, it sure touches it, or rather causes problems inside of IAM if not done well.
Yeah, and the compliance folks like the answers that DIDComm provide better than, well, we sent a text message, which they look at the security, NIST has said, don't do that. You guys, well, Matt, you would be aware, but up here in Canada, SMS is now very popular with all the banking institutions, solely because the government said you need a second factor. They all just turned on SMS, even though NIST has been saying for years, don't trust it as a second factor. They had no choice because the government was changing the game. It's kind of ridiculous because the SMS is, if I have you and if I've SIM swapped you, you're done.
Well, it's also a lesson in being careful what you legislate, right?
Yeah, don't be so prescriptive.
you got to be really careful that you don't mandate a bad solution.
Yep.
As you're trying to improve technology and everything else. And you could argue about whether it's better or worse, but certainly working with industry when you're passing legislation so that there are good options to the things you're legislating is pretty darn important.
I know the three of us are quite interested and often talk about the concept of trust registries. That seems like just another type of thing that could be added on top to existing trust tasks, such as exchanging credentials. It seems like you just have a lot more flexibility beyond that. And it seems like if you're, I guess to my earlier question, if I'm a program lead for a digital identity program, and it's like a public service type of thing, I think you add a lot more value to the system by giving that flexibility, because beyond just your initial use cases, you're going to be able to help reduce costs of establishing trust within different other ecosystems altogether. So it seems like there is an IAM version that I guess we're all agreeing is not going to go anywhere, and OpenID seems to have a lot of traction right now, which is great because it's really up-leveling verifiable credentials. But there's maybe a lot of other stuff that wouldn't cost too much to invest in, but would bring a lot of downstream benefits to the broader economies.
Yeah, there's a lot of examples on banking fraud and this is one thing, MemberPass, I think, might have been the first trust registry. But the business problem it's trying to solve is, for example, one of the customers of MemberPass is Desert Financial. You can set up a Desert Financial where the A at the end of financial looks like an A, but it's actually a Unicode character. It's a Slavic character, looks very much like an A, and duplicate their website and steal my credentials every time. But if my system is already saying, no, hang on, I need to check the public DID of this entity, and funny, doesn't match. Or they can't sign, they can't prove that they are who they say they are. I go beyond just the TLS, you have a certificate, which is almost meaningless nowadays, to being warned something's up here because that human readable address is not what you think it is.
Well, I think that so the issue of trust registries actually applies to anytime you have verifiable credentials or DIDs, like across the board. So in this case, there's not necessarily something special that applies to DIDComm versus OIDC, but it is a very important topic, and advancing work here is useful. DIDComm does have the ability to reach out and ask people for their credentials in a nice way, even if you're not directly interfacing with their website or something else. And so there is, and this is not has not been exercised very broadly yet, but because you can with a DID, you can communicate with another party. It's possible that you might be able to reach out and say, I'd like your credentials. I'd like to know why you're qualified to issue this thing that I just received. And there's most of the initial use cases we're seeing with verifiable credentials and with trust registries and governance and all that stuff. It tends to be very focused on a smaller specific ecosystem, because that's how these things grow. You don't do it top down so much; it ends up coming kind of bottom up, where you have some industry association or some group that kind of deploys these solutions, and so they're working on sort of like the little g governance, where there's like within this little ecosystem, here's the rules of how it works, and those will grow and expand, and don't cease to exist at all, but they'll keep going. Eventually, though, we're going to get to the point where you end up encountering new ecosystems that you have not been involved in previously at all. And so I'm looking forward to the time when credentials are out there such in the wild that you end up encountering credentials. Let's say you hire an employee and you ask them for whatever credentials they would like to, or maybe in the interview process, whatever credentials they'd like to present as part of their application. And you're likely to get a bunch of credentials that you already know and recognize, but you might get a bunch that you don't. And the ability to reach out to those parties and to use a DID as a common identifier to find trusted information about them makes the whole system pretty flexible as you're trying to coordinate and discover things. It doesn't mean that you're just going to instantly trust something because you see something new and you're like, oh, that's cool. I bet you they're not lying about this. That's a bad idea. But it gives you the mechanism to reach out and determine things, or at least discover things that you can then evaluate the trustability of. And so I like the ability to communicate between all of the parties on the internet, or things, people, organizations, via a standard method, because I think there's real power there. And I think that the advanced solutions that we have in the future are going to need that. They're going to need the ability to interact and directly communicate, with a couple of exceptions. WordPress APIs being one of them, because there's WordPress instances all over the place. It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to reach out and discover commonality that you expected to exist in someone else's API. Another notable example might be like the OpenID based protocols, not necessarily for VCs, but just the regular OpenID protocols. Those are essentially APIs that have been in common adopted by systems all over the place. And the ability to reach out and try to coordinate with another party is useful. One of the people ask, well, with all the things that DIDComm can do, how on earth do you know which of those things the other party can do over DIDComm? There's a built-in feature discovery system that you can disclose to the other party, and you can ask them questions about what they're willing to disclose for the features that they support. And so this allows for, if I have a DID and I think I know who it is, I can reach out to them, make a connection, run feature discovery, and then with the protocols that they support, the Venn diagram of the protocols I support and the protocols they support, then I know what types of things I can communicate with that party about. Ideally, establishing trust and verifying who they really are is high on that list. Once you establish that and you gain a reasonable level of trust, then there's other sorts of protocols you can actually interact with them for, and that's a really powerful thing. It's frustrating to me that we have all this advanced internet technology, and we've had it for a while, and we've got cryptocurrency and I guess blockchains are kind of like a newish thing, but we haven't. Most of the stuff that's really in massive operation today is not very new. It's frustrating to me that rather than sending a request to the pizza place in town, asking them what their hours are tomorrow is not a thing I can really do. You know what I have to do? I have to go to Google Maps and look at their hours that they've posted in there. I can look up what they've posted on social media. I can, Facebook or Instagram or something. I can go to their webpage, and even with things like microformats, there's still not very much information that I can get from them to actually just have this simple digital question sent to the pizza parlor and get an answer back. And not generally, are you open on a Thursday, but what are your hours tomorrow? Because it might be a holiday, or there may have been some.
What were your hours yesterday? What were your hours yesterday, 4th of July? Right.
Right. Totally. And that type of interaction, it boggles my mind that we're not to the point where we can just do that.
Well, and this is part of the, as well as I was mentioning, I mean, again, I really do appreciate what we get with OpenID, OAuth, and whatnot. But when you're coming from the non-identity world and you don't understand the conventions that are used there, it's a really strange way to do stuff. Like if you're coming from, hey, I got data, I want to do a query, give me the data and I'll do my thing. The dance you have to do, the back and forth, it just makes no sense to you. So people don't even grok. They don't understand what they even need to do, which is also why the IAM world is as big as it is. It's the IAM world. It's not part of the ERP world. Yes, you need to log in and permissions and stuff, but it has not bumped into that as well.
But do you think with like citizen ID programs, the IAM world is so entrenched in there, which perhaps is why these technologies are being pushed or recommended over others?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the amount of times I need to use my government ID to do citizen stuff is pretty slim. Banks will always say, well, it's onboarding. Well, that's their problem. They want to see lots of onboardings. I've onboarded to a bank 4 times in the last 5 years, and that's because I started a business and I moved across the country. Normally, I don't open bank accounts. It's not a normal thing I do. Well, except when I'm money laundering. Never mind. The question on the government side is, okay, cool. It's great if it does that, but what does that system create as far as an ability to surveil the population? It's a hard question to answer when you're sitting there doing a web-centric approach. If you're doing it that way, and I have knowledge that you used your ID for some purpose at that endpoint, which happens to be a liquor or cannabis establishment, I know something. If I can break that, it's one of the reasons why I love working with GovBC, is they don't want the ability to even have that to ask the possible question, where is this stuff being used? Because administrative curiosity will drive that behavior. The best of intention, someone will ask the question, and it's a slippery slope down to, hey, we're going to block you and or cut your benefits because you went and bought alcohol. You went and saw an R-rated movie or something.
I think you asked the question about government's involvement here, right? And one of the comments that I'd like to make is that I think governments can play a valuable role in identity, but I think that the piece of the identity pie that will end up being coordinated primarily by government is actually pretty darn small. And we don't have to wait for it. I think they can benefit from all the technologies we're talking about, but the technologies that we've got today are usable in really powerful ways. And so, and a lot of people think, well, I'm just going to let the government do the thing, and then I'm going to build on top of it. And the answer is you might be able to interact with it in a minor way, and it might be helpful and make some things easier. I'm not knocking that at all. And there's lots of good that governments can do, but realistically speaking, the amount of cool applications of credentials and DIDs and DIDComm and OpenID for VC and all these things, I think far exceeds the sort of the non-government uses far exceeds the government uses for these types of things.
Yeah, and the reason why I bring up the governments, it seems like a lot of our industry kind of sways in the direction of where the recommendations are coming from, and it seems like quite recently there's been a lot of pushes for these protocols like OpenID for VC and stuff that are quite newer, don't necessarily have the same amount of implementations. Again, I want to try to be more objective with the commentary here, but I think although I agree with you that there are thousands, tens of thousands, millions of identity systems throughout the world, governments are a very small percentage. It seems to have a big impact on the digital identity folks, and so I don't know if all of the hype that's happening around OpenID for VC is a good thing or not, Darrell, for something like DIDComm or these other things. Does it help with adoption? Does it get in the way? I know you perhaps have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps in the long term. In the short term, it kind of, when you look at the DIDComm approach, this peer-to-peer approach that Sam's talking about, which is far more elegant, and honestly, as a developer, as a recovering developer, I don't write code anymore, it's far simpler. Like I can do stuff with it that I could never do on an OID for VC approach. It's helpful for the long term because it drives the interest in the credentialing. It drives the interest in the getting a credential. It drives interest in saying, damn, I wish I could have updated that credential without having to go log back into the site, press the update button. You got any updates for me before I went to go to work and my card didn't work. I really want to be able to do that. And so it enables awareness of the problem. It's a double-edged sword. Both, like I said, short term, what I'm seeing is people who have OID for VC, if they have the ability to integrate it, it's really easy for them to do, which is freaking awesome because the consumption of credentials is as valuable or more. It's really valuable for me to get at and use a credential, not just issuance. Issuance is no one's going to make money on that. No one's going to add much value on that. They're going to add value by consuming multiple different things. What's really, really cool and is watching the other group say, well, hey, we have this OID for VC approach we're going to use. Is like, yeah, but your data is sitting over there in an education system. They're like, but now they're recognizing there's more steps to be taken, and that's where the long term, I think, really helps.
So it looks like the ideal situation is these things probably live beside each other. You did mention earlier, Sam, that you could use one to bootstrap into the other one. Is that the way you see the architecture? Is just the wallets and the infrastructure that are going to facilitate the exchange of credentials just need to speak both languages?
So I need to highlight here that we will always live with the need to have a multi-credential format and multiple signature type and multiple protocol world. For the simple reason that whatever we create today is unlikely to be perfect, and we're going to come up with the next version of it. And you're going to have to transition your software to first speak both of them and then deprecate the old one, for example. And so I think there's this sort of this false idea that folks have that, well, we're just going to pick the one protocol and then we don't have to do anything else. And I think that's a false idea. I think that you need to support the protocols that are necessary for your interaction. And this already comes up, we, in addition to the OpenID for VC stuff, you also have like the ISO MDL proximity, flow. And that's like another protocol. And so you're never going to get away with just one protocol. So one warning voice there is that don't assume that you can just make one choice and then just move forward with it and everything's going to work out. The same thing is true of credential types, specifically because we're going to invent a better one. I hope so. I hope we have cooler, newer stuff in the future, and you're going to then have to support that. So again, you're going to have to do that. Now, that in the short term, Darrell's totally correct. The wide variety of things in the short term does increase the complexity and the development costs for those of us, looking to help customers deploy solutions. or customers building their own. It adds a lot of complexity, and that's a little unfortunate. As long as we make it through this, then I think it's going to be good. One of the really excellent things that the OpenID for VC folks have done is explain and evangelize their solution. And I think that on the DIDComm side of things, I think we've been kind of so busy doing things, we haven't really spent much time actually evangelizing and explaining the solution very well. And so when you go searching up the various technologies, you're going to find a much more convincing and easy to understand story on the OpenID for VC side of things. They've just done a great job. And I think that was kind of one big lesson is like, wow, we really need to do this. I think I realized that we kind of really starkly that if we don't spend time evangelizing the protocols that we want people to support, we're going to spend time, developing support for the protocols that we don't, right? That we don't favor. And so we've got to. You can't just ignore it. Either way, it's bad. But yes, I'm excited for the future of this. I think that honestly, this is mostly in the situation of a rising tide, floats all ships. I'm definitely in the camp of VCs as a means to an end instead of VCs as an end. I know a lot of folks that are very, very narrowly focused on VCs, and that's great. They'll advance verifiable credentials, and that's good for all of us. I'm also very interested in what we do because of VCs or with the power of VCs instead of just the direct transfer of VCs themselves.
Yeah, I agree, except I'm disappointed, Sam, that there isn't one protocol to rule them all. But I get it. What excites me is verifiable credentials allow us to do, if we looked at this conversation of, DIDComm and verifiable credentials, that allows us to connect the DIDComm side and then to exchange some trusted authentic data. What excites me is more, and then what? And then what do we do? What are we negotiating? Are we negotiating a business deal? Are we sharing information about sensors in a highly secure network that we don't want others to have access to, or that I just really need to know was signed by that device that's issuing, a CO2 permit or something? What I can do with it once I have connected and exchanged a little bit of data is really, really crazy to me. And I do it over that comms channel that we established. So I think it's really powerful that way.
So this is a little bit of a different angle, but the other problem that we have to solve for people, and this works for businesses too, but for people specifically, is auto configuration of digital connections. And I'll give you an example of one. We now have a crazy number of payment methods that didn't used to exist. Of course, we've got like credit cards, but I'm talking about and not just PayPal either. I'm talking about Google Pay or paying with your Amazon account, or all of these things that are kind of all over the place. Different banks have different types of payment systems. And so when you have an opportunity to pay somebody, whenever you list something like on Craigslist or like an online kind of person to person, used stuff selling market, you always have this conversation about what payment methods is going to happen. Oh, hey, well, I could take this or that. Well, I could take this, or, and you kind of have to manually do this thing. And that works mostly because there's a couple of common ones. But I've seen pictures of storefronts in foreign countries, like in Asian countries, where there's literally like 40 different accepted payment methods.
Well, the ATMs used to have that, exactly that. It was what network was it on? You had to walk up and go, next one.
Right. So here's my dream here is that when I'm trying to coordinate payment, be it with the taco truck or Darrell, like I can, our software, I could say, please suggest payment methods. And then his software and my software talk over a DIDComm protocol to coordinate payment methods. And I might have preferences and he might have preferences. And it might be complicated to the fact where Darrell will say, hey, I'll take PayPal, but only if you do an extra 3%. I don't mean to pick on PayPal.
Or you even get up with the craziness of, hey, I'll take that pets.com token that for whatever reason you love. I've got it. I don't want it, but it's equivalent. Sure. Yeah.
Or the Sword of Azeroth, or whatever it happens to be, right? And we need that because we have. I love the innovation in the financial space, but it presents this NASCAR type solution navigation for people, and that's painful. How much cooler would it be if my software just popped up and said, hey, here's the top 3 ways you think you probably want to pay Darrell, and it's based on extra fees that Darrell is talking about, or how fast the payment can resolve. There may be other sorts of requirements there that are interesting. How much guarantee there is in the payment method. And then I can sort of pick one and make it happen. Even just figuring out how to pay you is something that we've got to figure out in a much better way, because right now it's way more annoying than it ought to be.
We went through an exact example of this. The business case was with getting money wired from someone to their uncle. So the person was, we didn't wire the money, but we did all the prepping from someone in Virginia to their uncle in Estonia. So there was many different things. Like, one is where do I send the money to Uncle Seam? And the answer, is really hard, because they're not on SWIFT. They're on this thing called SEPA. SEPA is an EU-centric payment system. But when you break it apart to say, hey, listen, we're doing really 2 things. Compliance. Can I send to my Uncle Seam in Estonia? Okay. KYC. Is anybody a bad person on a bad list? Do all that dance. That's a pure DIDComm conversation with credentialing, saying, hey, the credit union on either side is vouching for this person. They've issued a credential. But then we had hey, how do I send money to you? And if you in Canada ask me to send money to a SEPA address, I literally have no clue what to do. I know how to send money to a US wire destination. I know how to send money to a SWIFT destination. And I'm terrified every time I do it that I'm going to fat finger. In this case, the app said, here's the stuff you need to know to send me the money. It sends it through. What was neat was that conversation, they've tried to build an identity down to SWIFT, and it just has never worked. The messaging system, you end up with people not hacking it, but screwing with it. So you end up with that company's on the list, but we'll modify it a little bit. That spelling mistake makes it not on the list, but it's good enough to get the money. We solved the problem of doing the identity conversation, asking the wallet, what payment methods do you support? Hey, I have alignment here. Let's go. Do the thing. And the do the thing was actually quite boring. It was send money over SWIFT to another credit union that relayed it to Estonia. It was very, very simple. But that's all possible. And you can't do that. You can't do that with a web-centric approach.
Well, I was the last time I wired money, we built a house and I borrowed some money from my parents for part of the process. And so we had to wire money back and forth because that's the only reasonable way to move larger amounts of money. And so, you go to the bank, and wire transfers are used for fraud so much that they try to like help you not get stuck in fraud stuff. And so I get there and they're like, yeah, I need to wire some money. Here's the stuff. And they're like, how'd you get this information? From my mother. Like on a phone call, like it was kind of a funny conversation because I understood what they were doing, but like this was not an answer. But I'm still terrified with identifier based money transfers because I'm like, you get 1 digit wrong and it's gone. Like there's, you know what I mean?
There's no recourse.
No. And so how much better would it be if my mom said, hey, she went into her, an app on her phone for her bank and said, I want to coordinate a wire to me. And she was issued from her bank a verifiable credential that contained the account information for the destination.
Yep.
And then she sent it to me and said, "Here, by the way, here's a credential that you can verify that it's authentic to my bank." And then I can take that and pass it to my bank and say, "Okay, here's the destination. Here's the amount of money that I want to send." And now they have confidence that it actually has not been tampered with, and that no one fat fingered it along the way.
There's a really neat Blue Cross up in Alberta did a study on the overall customer journey from signing up as a customer through to having some bad stuff happen on travel. Bad travel, you're medevaced out, and you're talking, in the States, millions of dollars potentially. They went through where are the stress points along the journey? The number one stress point. This is people who had horrific things happen. The number one common stress point was typing in your account information. It's like, what?
Right?
It's like, because everyone's like, if I get this wrong, I am screwed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that we haven't come up with a better solution. But the reason why this example is interesting is that if I have to do this, if I have to move this credential and exchange this credential about in various ways that require lots of manual touch points, the way that current sort of credential-based scan a code types of interactions are being designed, it's going to be very cumbersome. If I've got a secure connection to my mom she has one with her bank. I have one with my bank. The process of actually receiving that information and then transferring it securely all the way to the end is pretty straightforward. And I think that those are the types of interactions and flows that we need to be looking about. And again, it's not about the credential. The credential performs a really useful feature of having trusted data go from point A to point B and have it be verifiable and tamper resistant and all that useful stuff. But it's about the transfer of the money to my mother, not the fact that that there was a credential being used to do it.
Yeah. And Matthew, you're working on project, I know that I'm going to get the acronym wrong, TSM, where you're actually looking at environmental data with regards to energy and mining activity. You have the supply chain that goes quite deep. If I have to write to an API to do stuff, I'm only going to go so deep. If I can actually look at the credentials and say, okay, cool, you were issued by whom? Tell me about that. I can just walk it all back using the same technology, have the same assurances that, yes, that information came from a trusted source all the way back.
I think this is a good way of looking at it. Is just, I feel like we spend so much time in the space, like looking at verifiable credential trust triangles, and it's just a limiting view, because just in the example you gave, Sam, you're going to do different things like just in one journey, right? So just moving away from that, I think is helpful, and moving away from just talking about wallets and VCs and more just talking about the journey, talking about how having more integrity in the journey can help reduce fraud or reduce costs or whatever the journey is. But I feel like this verifiable credential trust triangle with the credential and the wallet is just, it's so limiting in thinking.
I feel like we're back in the days that like we're back into the business conversation, which is the important stuff. And when we get into the trust triangle, where it's almost like asking someone, is that an inner or an outer join when you're doing a database query? It's like, I don't remember, and I really don't. I just want the freaking data. Give me data. Give me the stuff. Let me do stuff with it.
I don't mean to knock on the development of technical stuff, because it's really important. I'm glad, for example, that
absolutely
has had amazing energy put into it, and the web is generally secure. I'm really happy about that. And I feel like a lot of what we're doing with verifiable credentials is at that level. But we also have to recognize that, like, my mom is not that person. And she's also not a business that's concerned about how to solve like regular business problems that they have. And so what we don't do very well, I think, is customize the conversation to the audience that we're actually talking to, so that they understand it at a level that makes sense. And so, like, we don't ever bring up the trust triangle very often in technical conversations, because we all get it. We all understand the basics. But that's still really useful when someone's like, I don't get it. Why am I doing a verifiable credential instead of calling an API with the other providing service that has the information? It's really useful to help people learn at those levels. But I think that what we end up doing is kind of arguing about the wrong stuff in the wrong context. And that's really problematic. It's helpful to argue about the technical things and make sure we make good choices there. But then when we guide customers to solutions, we need to we need to like help that happen. There's been a lot of bickering, might be the technical term, about, well, your solution is not quite as good as mine for this particular small reason, and so I'm going to tell people that going with you is a massive mistake and their whole business is going to burn because of it, when in reality it's generally not that way. You do have to make good technology choices, but so long as you're choosing good vendors that are working with open standards and trying to make this stuff work in a really great way, you're going to end up succeeding. And I think that people are really paranoid about making the wrong technical choice when there's actually a variety of good technical choices in front of them in order to make this happen.
Yeah, and that's what I get flown in to help solve that. I agree with you that people are hearing from some vendors, pick this, it's all you'll ever need. Like, no, that's not true. That's simply not true. But yeah, there's a ton of stuff. And I when it comes down to which standard, and if you say you're interoperable, I care, just not that much. It's I want to come in and find out what's the business problem we're solving. What are the options, and how are you going to live with that for the next, if you need to, 5, 10, 20 years? And that's, I think, Sam, where the long term is. All of these things are going to fall into place. We're going to know this fits here because reasons. This here still works perfect. It's awesome. It's the best way to do it. It's fast, simple.
Well, and one of the mistakes I think people fall into is they expect to try and do something with this really new technology and then not have to touch it for 20 years. And I'm like, it's going to require some maintenance. The system will still work, but you're going to have to like move it forward the way technology does. This is new, right? And things are moving relatively fast. The best advice from a business perspective is find a solution that either saves you or makes you money in the short term and go with that. If you're trying to figure out how the choices you're going to make today are going to solve the problems you're going to have in 20 years, it's going to help the problems you have in 20 years, but none of us can see that far ahead. So instead, pick an applicable way to deploy this technology that solves problems you have in front of you and makes it better. And that way, even though adjustments, I promise you, will be required as time marches on and things happen and new things are discovered, invented, et cetera. If you start with something that solves a problem and makes or saves money today, and then keep moving forward, then it's going to be worth your investment, even though things are still moving.
Similar to that, though, it's also important, if I look at some of our clients, to understand that, hey, you're going to need to invest at the down and dirty level in the beginning until it becomes normalized. Like right now, I look at some of our clients were deep funders of some of the earliest of things in the SSI space. Now they just use it. Like they've actually stepped away because they're solving their business problems, not the nerdy parts, because that part's already working. So it's also a need how they, what problems do they need to actually work on and worry about today, and when can they not have to worry about some of those? That's just as important too.
You make a good point. One of the good things, but also hard things about open source is that when people use open source and succeed, they usually just move on to the next thing. And because they're not like paying some license fee to some company whose marketing department is going to reach out to get a quote from them about how successful the product has been, there's a lot of successfully deployed open source stuff that just no one ever brings up because they're too busy or they don't recognize there's a need to have people hear about their success or whatever else. And so that's great because people would just use it to have success. But I sort of wish that like more people that deployed stuff would speak up and be like, hey, I did a thing. I'd love to like show you. And because there's so much of that actually happens, and open source communities tend to be much larger than you see on the surface because of that very fact.
I think it was pretty helpful to distinguish OpenID from DIDComm and just talk about some of the different things you could do. And then we kind of shifted more towards looking at it more from a business perspective. Then you kind of start thinking about what I should be using. But I think at the end of the day, like the OpenID stuff is good for verifiable credentials because you're injecting integrity into wallets. Like you're injecting signed payloads, which we don't have today, that maybe downstream they could be used in different ways. And so I think all of this stuff is all good.
You're also meeting the customer where they are. If their data, the data they want to share, are sitting in some kind of an identity and access management system, why wouldn't you do it that way? It makes no sense to do it unless there's some compelling reason. Just make it simple, make it fast. Like as Sam, you mentioned WordPress. If you need to log in with Google, just turn on the login with Google capability. Like that's not even to do with us, but make it easy for them to adopt and focus on their own business, not the underlying details of the tech.
Right. Is Federation perfect? No. Is it better than what you're doing before? Yes. Right. Yeah. So there's definitely good steps forward there. It's very important to not let perfect be the enemy of the good, and to move forward with things that you can today without stressing about all the things coming along tomorrow.
But along that line, though, I was just thinking. I agree. The just recently, I started logging into some sites for the first time that weren't, Web3 crypto psychos. They were saying log in with wallet, like, yeah, whatever. I was on a business forum, and the top item was log in with wallet. Then below had a ton: Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Google. But the number one isolated one was wallet. Now that's a crypto wallet. I'm looking forward to the success point when it says log in with DID, or whatever the marketing name that it comes up with, and people hit it because they know it means more than just logging in. It's, oh, my life is now going to be easy. It's actually going to be able to interact in a normal way, not a client-server forced way.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Metzer Glode on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.